The iron gates of Merofin Court groaned like a thing in pain. It was the kind of sound the northern wind had been drawing out of them for 18 years, slow, corroded, indifferent to dignity, and Leofric had long since stopped hearing it. He heard it tonight. He did not know why. He sat in his study with the threadbare velvet of his waistcoat pulled close against the cold, his silver-streaked hair uncombed, a glass of port untouched at his elbow, and he listened to those gates moan in the dark as though they were announcing something he was not prepared for. He had spent nearly 2 decades in this room, not always seated. He had moved through the estate, attended to his ledgers, received the few visitors who still considered him worth visiting, but he had always, in the way that mattered, been here, anchored to the chair behind the desk where Elswith had once stood across from him, her hands pressed flat against her mouth, her eyes dry with a restraint that had cost her everything. He had not moved, because moving felt like abandoning the last coordinates of her, the last and known place she had existed before she chose the fenland dark over another morning in his house. The door to his chamber opened without a knock. She stood in the threshold the way her mother never had, not diminished by it, not framed by it, but occupying it entirely, as though the doorway had been built to her measurements. The candles in the hall threw her silhouette forward into the room, and, for one arrested moment, Leofric's mind did what it had been doing for 18 years. It reached for Elswith. It dressed the figure in ivory muslin. It softened the jaw. It prepared the old, useless guilt. Then the woman stepped into the candlelight, and the resemblance rearranged itself into something far more dangerous than a ghost. She had her mother's eyes, that same dark measuring quality, the kind that recorded everything and returned nothing. But the set of her jaw was new. The stillness of her hands at her sides was new. And what she carried, held not against her chest but at her hip, almost casually, the way a woman carries something she has no intention of surrendering, was a letter, sealed in legal wax, bearing the vain Tresillian crest on its face like a wound turned inside out. Leofric did not speak. He had forgotten suddenly how. She crossed the room without invitation, past the side table where 2 gold rings still sat in their shallow dish, unmoved for 18 years, as though touching them would constitute an admission. And she set the letter on his desk, with a sound like a verdict being read aloud. "I am not her," she said. Her voice was quiet and had no interest in comfort. "But I am what she left behind, and I have come to collect everything this house owes." The candle between them guttered. The port sat untouched, and somewhere deep in the bones of Merofin Court, the cradle that had waited empty in the nursery for 18 years seemed, at last, to understand that the waiting was over. My beautiful family, if this story has your heart racing, hit like and subscribe to join us daily. I'd love to know who is listening. Tell me your city and the time where you are, because I'd love to welcome you personally in the comments. Merofin Court had not collapsed dramatically. That would have required a kind of passion the estate no longer possessed. Instead, it had done something quieter and more final. It had simply stopped trying, room by room, wing by wing, over the slow accumulation of 18 northern winters. It had surrendered to the particular entropy of a house that no longer believed in itself. The east gallery ceiling had given way in the 3rd year. A section of plaster the size of a dining table descend one morning without warning onto the parquet below, and Leofric had ordered it swept up, and the doors sealed and had not spoken of it again. The portrait corridor had gone dark when the wall sconces rusted beyond lighting in the 9th year. No one had replaced them. The servants who remained, and there were few enough of them now, a skeleton staff of loyal and privately grieving people, had learned to carry their own candles through that stretch of hall, moving past the painted faces of dead Tresillians in the way one moves past the bereaved. Quietly, without eye contact. The gardens were the most honest record of what had happened to Leofric. A garden requires a person who believes the future is worth planting for, and Leofric had lost that conviction on the morning he found the side gate unlatched and the fenland fog already swallowing whatever footprints remained. The topiary had grown into formlessness within 5 years, the careful geometric shapes dissolving into dense, artless mass. The lavender beds, those same beds where Elswith had knelt in her early months at Merophon, pressing her fingers into the soil with a hopefulness he had never thought to ask about, had gone to seed and then to weed, and then to a grey, matted nothing that the groundskeeper no longer bothered to annotate in his reports. The stone pathways between them were cracked now, lifted by frost and root, and in the cracks grew small, persistent things that no one had planted and no one could be troubled to remove. Inside, the house smelled of cold ash and old beeswax and the faint, trapped staleness of rooms that had not been properly aired since a woman with dark braided hair had last moved through them with purpose. The staff had maintained the essentials. The Duke's study, his bedchamber, the dining room he used perhaps twice weekly, the kitchen. But the rest of Merophon existed in a state of careful suspension, its furniture draped in Holland cloth, its curtains drawn against light that no longer seemed welcome. Visitors in the early years had remarked on it with the careful diplomatic language of people who meant something they would not say directly. By the 10th year, there were no visitors to remark on anything. Leofric had told himself in the beginning that the isolation was temporary, a season of withdrawal, of necessary quiet, while he determined what had happened and what ought to be done about it. He had sent men into the fenland. He had corresponded with the county magistrate, with distant family, with the physician Lockmere, who had attended Elswith through the pregnancy, and who had received the news of her disappearance, with an expression Leofric had found, at the time, inexplicably close to relief. Nothing had come of any of it. The Fens kept their secrets the way the Fens had always kept secrets, by absorbing them entirely, by making the landscape itself an accomplice, and so the temporary had become permanent, the way it always does when a man cannot locate the precise moment he stopped fighting for something. What troubled the remaining staff, what they discussed in low voices in the kitchen on winter evenings, was not the decay of the estate itself, but the decay of the man inside it. The Duke had always been cold. They had made their peace with that in the early years of his marriage. Cold was manageable. Cold had a logic to it. But what Leofric had become over 18 years was something more difficult to name. He moved through the house like a man executing a series of obligations he no longer understood the purpose of. He ate without appetite, slept without rest, conducted his estate business with a mechanical precision that impressed no one because it was clearly connected to nothing. No ambition, no pride, not even the grim satisfaction of a man who has chosen austerity as a philosophy. He had simply continued because stopping required a decision, and he had run out of those. The nursery he had never opened, not once since 18 years. It sat at the end of the east corridor, behind a door that had not been sealed. He had never given the order, and no one had presumed to act without it, and the staff cleaned around it in the way people clean around something sacred or something shameful, which in Merophon Court had long been the same category of thing. The cradle inside was still there. They knew because Osythe had told them, before she vanished too, in that first terrible month, that it was still there, and that the Duchess had looked at it last, and that this meant something, though none of them could say precisely what. It was into this house, this still, suffocating, silver-haired monument to a grief that had never been properly named. That the young woman with Elswith's eyes had walked without knocking, set a letter on a desk like a blade laid flat, and spoken 4 words that cracked 18 years of silence down the middle. Merofen Court held its breath. For the first time in a very long while, something inside its walls was about to begin. He did not open the letter immediately. That would have been a concession, and Leofric Vane Tresillian had spent 53 years perfecting the art of not conceding anything before he had assessed the full dimensions of what was being asked of him. Instead, he looked at it, at the legal wax, the impressed crest, the particular quality of the parchment, which was not cheap and was not local. And then he looked at the woman who had placed it there, and he did the thing he had always done when confronted with something he could not immediately categorize. He made his face into nothing and waited. She waited too. She was extraordinarily good at it. She stood with her hands loose at her sides, her dark hair falling over one shoulder. Her eyes, Elswith's eyes, he could not stop arriving at this fact, resting on him with a patience that felt less like calm and more like the particular stillness of someone who has already won and is simply allowing the other party the courtesy of discovering it themselves. "Sit down," he said, because he was still the Duke of Merofen and this was still his study, and he would not conduct whatever this was with a stranger, standing over his desk like a magistrate. "I prefer to stand," she said, not rudely. Simply as a statement of fact, the way one might note the weather. He opened the letter. It had been drawn up by a solicitor in Edinburgh, a firm of considerable reputation, old enough to predate Leofric's own title, which meant they had not been retained hastily or cheaply. The document was thorough in the way that only documents written by people anticipating resistance tend to be thorough. It named him Leofric Hallowin Vane Tresillian, Duke of Merofen in full. It named Elswith Malin Tresillian, born Vale Carneth, as mother. It named the child, a daughter born alive and healthy on the 14th of March, 18 years prior, in a cottage outside the village of Ardtennock on the Scottish coast. And it established, through a chain of witnesses and dated declarations and one letter signed in Elswith's own unmistakable hand, that this daughter was the legitimate heir to the Vane Tresillian estate, conceived within lawful marriage, born of a living mother, and entitled under the terms of the original Merofen entailment to present her claim in person. Leofric read it twice. Then he set it down with the exaggerated steadiness of a man who does not trust his hands. "Your mother is alive," he said. It was not quite a question. "She was," the young woman said, "when she wrote that letter. Whether she remains so is a matter I am not yet prepared to discuss with you." The distinction landed precisely where she intended it to. He felt it move through him like cold water finding a crack in stone. He tried, then, the thing men like him always tried when the ground shifted beneath them. He attempted to locate a procedural objection. The document's jurisdiction, the validity of a Scottish birth record applied against an English entailment. The question of whether the solicitor had seen to. "The firm has already corresponded with the Lord Chancellor's office," she said, as though she had anticipated each exit before he reached it, as though she had spent years, and he understood suddenly, with a lurch, that she had, mapping every possible avenue of his retreat and closing it in advance. The entailment language is unambiguous. A legitimate child of the marriage, regardless of sex, inherits ahead of any collateral claim. You have no sons, you have no brothers with sons. You have, as of tonight, a daughter standing in your study with more legal right to the Merofen title than you have had since the morning she was born. The candle between them had burned nearly to its collar. Outside, the rain had not relented. Leofric became aware, in the particular way of a man whose body registers what his mind refuses, that his hands were cold, that the port at his elbow had been untouched so long it had gone flat, that the room, his study, the one fixed coordinate of 18 years of hollow endurance, felt different now that she was in it, smaller, somehow, reordered around a new center of gravity he had not agreed to and could not remove. He looked at her face again, looked properly this time, with the resigned attention of a man accepting a sentence. She had Elswith eyes and Elswith stillness, yes, but the architecture beneath them was his own. The jaw, the particular set of the brow, the way she held her shoulders, not defensively, but with the unconscious authority of someone who had never been taught to make herself small, and had therefore never learned to. He had given her that, at least. Unwillingly, unknowingly, at a distance of 18 years and the full width of the country. But he had given it. "What is your name?" he said. Not a demand, barely even a question. The voice of a man receiving information he should have had from the beginning. She looked at the 2 gold rings in their dish on the cider table. Looked at them for a moment with an expression he could not read. Not grief, exactly. Not contempt, exactly. But something that contained both and had calcified into something harder than either. Then she looked back at him. "My mother named me Maron," she said. "She did not give me your name. I have come to decide for myself whether I want it." He had not intended to follow her. That was the first thing he told himself when he found himself standing in the doorway of the portrait corridor at midnight, candle in hand, watching the light from Maren's lamp move ahead of him through the dark like something he had no business chasing. She had been shown to the east guest room, the only guest room still maintained with anything approaching dignity, by the housekeeper, Mrs. Pellew, who had received the news of the young woman's arrival, and her identity with the particular composure of someone who had been privately expecting something of this nature for quite some time. Leofric had returned to his study. He had sat down. He had remained sitting for perhaps 20 minutes before his body, acting entirely without instruction from whatever remained of his rational mind, had stood him up and brought him here. Maron walked the corridor the way her mother never had. Elswith had always moved through Verofan with a careful, peripheral quality, as though she were trying to occupy the least possible amount of the house's attention. Touching nothing, disturbing nothing, making herself a guest in her own home. Maron moved as though she were conducting an inventory. She stopped at each portrait, raised her lamp to it, studied the painted face with the unhurried focus of a woman reading a document she intends to use. She did not know he was behind her, or perhaps she did, and had decided his presence was beneath acknowledgement. He could not tell. Both possibilities disturbed him equally. He watched her stop before the portrait of his mother, the 4th Duchess of Merofan. Rendered in oils at 35 in a gown the color of deep water, her expression the compressed, resigned dignity of a woman who has accepted a life she did not precisely choose. Maron looked at it for a long time. Then she moved on to the portrait beside it, which was his own, commissioned on the occasion of his 30th birthday and capturing, with unfortunate accuracy, the precise quality of cold authority that he had worn in those years, like armor he had forgotten was armor. She looked at his painted face. Then she turned and looked at his actual face, finding him in the dark of the corridor without surprise, without alarm, as though she had known all along he was there, and had simply been waiting for him to stop pretending otherwise. "You look older than that now," she said, not unkindly, merely as an observation. 18 years will do it, he said, and hated immediately how unguarded it sounded. She left him in the corridor and took herself to bed, and Leofric stood alone among his ancestors for a long time after her lamp had disappeared around the corner. It was there, in that particular darkness, that the haunting began in earnest. not the dramatic haunting of Gothic imagination. No cold hands or whispered names, but something far more corrosive. Memory, rising unbidden and specific, refusing the vagueness that 18 years of discipline had almost managed to impose on it. He remembered Elswyth in this same corridor in the first winter of their marriage, pausing before the portrait of the third Duke, with an expression of cautious curiosity she had not yet learned to suppress around him. He remembered her asking quietly whether the man had been kind. He remembered that he had not answered her because the question had struck him as irrelevant, as the sort of soft inquiry that had no useful place in the management of an estate and a title and a lineage. He understood now, with the merciless clarity that only arrives too late to be of any use, that she had not been asking about the third Duke at all. She had been asking about him. She had been standing in his ancestral corridor, newly married, already uncertain, reaching toward him in the only indirect way she had yet found. And he had looked at her and seen a question about a portrait. He pressed the heel of his hand against the wall and breathed. It continued the following morning. He came down to find Maren already at the breakfast table, which no one had occupied at that hour in years, and the sight of a woman seated there in the early grey light hit him somewhere beneath reasoning. She was wearing dark travelling clothes, practical, well-made, nothing like Elswyth's soft muslins, and she had a small leather notebook open beside her plate and was writing in it with the focused economy of someone accustomed to working alone. But the angle of her head, the way her left hand rested flat on the table beside the notebook, fingers slightly spread as though steadying something. That had been Elswyth's gesture entirely, one of those small physical habits so particular to a person that they become a kind of signature, and seeing it reproduced now in this stranger who was not a stranger, this daughter assembled from all the years he had lost, made the breath leave his body in a way he could not account for, and would not have named aloud for any consideration. Maren looked up and caught him staring. He said nothing. He crossed to the sideboard and occupied himself with the coffee service and the simple, mechanical dignity of pouring a cup, and when he turned back to the table his face had been restored to its usual arrangement, and he sat down across from her as though the moment had not occurred. But she had seen it. He knew she had seen it because she looked at him for just a fraction of a second longer than the situation required, and in that fraction he saw something shift behind her eyes. Not softening, not sympathy, but a careful, clinical noting of information. She was filing it. The way he had once stood in a garden and filed the face of a woman holding a blade, cataloguing it for future use. His own habit returned to him in his daughter's eyes. He drank his coffee. Outside, the fenland lay grey and flat and endlessly patient under a colourless sky, and the house held the two of them inside it like an old argument that had finally found both its speakers, and did not intend to let either of them leave until it had been finished. Cressida Fenella Tressilian arrived at Merophon Court on the second morning of Maren's stay, which was not a coincidence, because nothing Cressida did was ever a coincidence. She came by private carriage, a good one, understated in the way that only genuinely expensive things can afford to be understated, and she descended from it in the grey mid-morning light, wearing a deep charcoal travelling coat over a gown the colour of old moss, her hair arranged with the severe, immaculate precision that had always made her look less like a woman who had dressed for the day, and more like a woman who had dressed for a particular engagement she intended to win. She was 44 years old. She looked like someone who had spent those 44 years collecting information, and had found the exercise deeply satisfying. Mrs. Pellow received her at the door with an expression that managed to be simultaneously unsurprised and deeply apprehensive, which was the expression most people eventually settled on in Cressida's presence. Leofric, who had been informed of the carriage's arrival by a housemaid, whose voice had carried the specific tremor of someone delivering news they considered above their pay grade, came down the main staircase to find his sister already in the entrance hall, pulling off her jet-black gloves one finger at a time, with the leisurely authority of a person who considers arrival formalities a mild imposition on her time. She looked up at him, she smiled, and it was a genuine smile which on Cressida was somehow more alarming than the alternative. "Brother," she said. "You knew," he said, not a greeting, not even an accusation, precisely, more the flat, airless delivery of a man identifying the shape of a thing he has just walked into. "I've known for 16 years, she said, and handed her gloves to Mrs. Pellew without looking at her. "Is there coffee? The roads from York are absolutely punishing in November." She told him the essentials in the morning room, seated across from him with her coffee cup, held in both hands, and her posture so composed it functioned as its own argument. She had found Ellsworth in the second year, not through any dramatic act of investigation. Cressida's methods had never been dramatic, which was precisely what made them effective, but through a network of quiet correspondences, a factor of geography, and the particular loyalty of Osyth Morcant, who had written to Cressida from the Scottish coast 8 months after the disappearance with a letter that said only, "She is safe, she has delivered. The child is a girl and she is well. I am asking you, as the one person in that house who ever wished her kindness, to leave them in peace." Cressida had left them in peace for 2 years. This, she explained to Leofric without apology, was as long as her conscience had permitted. "You said nothing to me," he said. "You had said everything you intended to say to her," Cressida replied. "I saw no reason to reward that with information." The precision of it silenced him. He had walked into that particular blade himself, and she had done him the courtesy of not twisting it further, simply leaving it where it had landed and continuing to drink her coffee. She had written to Ellsworth directly in the 3rd year. The correspondence had been slow at first, cautious, understandably, on Ellsworth's part, but it had established itself over time into something regular and, on both sides, apparently necessary. She had watched Maren grow through letters, had sent books. She was characteristically precise about this detail, listing several titles that told Leofric more about the kind of education his daughter had received than anything Maren herself had yet volunteered. Philosophy, estate law, the history of English land rights, Latin grammar, a complete annotated survey of the Merophon entailment obtained through channels Cressida declined to specify but which had clearly required both money and the willingness to ask difficult questions of inconvenient people. "You were preparing her," Leofric said. "Ellsworth was preparing her," Cressida said. "I was simply ensuring she had the correct tools." Maren appeared in the doorway of the morning room at 10:30 with her, notebook under her arm and the expression of someone who had timed her entrance with care. She looked at Cressida. Cressida looked at her. Something passed between them. Not the warmth of strangers becoming acquainted, but the ease of people resuming a relationship that had been conducted at a distance and was only now finding its physical form. Cressida rose, crossed the room, and took Maren's face briefly in both hands the way a person does when they have imagined a meeting for a very long time and are confirming, with their hands, that it is real. "You have her mouth," Cressida said quietly, "and rather more of his jaw than is entirely fair." "So I've been told," Maren said, and glanced at Leofric across the room with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite challenge, but occupied the precise territory between them. Leofric sat with his untouched coffee and looked at the 2 women in his morning room, his sister, who had been managing this situation for 16 years without his knowledge, and his daughter, who had arrived at Merophon armed with every instrument of his own undoing, and he understood, with the slow and total comprehension of a man watching a structure he believed he had built turn out to have been someone else's architecture, all along, that nothing about Maren's arrival had been spontaneous. Not the timing, not the Edinburgh solicitors, not the legal documentation assembled with such painstaking thoroughness. Not even, he suspected, the particular night she had chosen to arrive. The 18th anniversary of Elswith's disappearance, a date he had spent every year since trying to survive, and which Maren had selected with the deliberate, unflinching precision of someone who understood that the most effective kind of reckoning arrives exactly when it is least expected and most deserved. Cressida sat back down, refilled her cup, and looked at him over the rim with the expression she had been perfecting since childhood, the one that said she had known how this would end before it had begun, and had loved him enough to let him discover it for himself. "You should probably," she said mildly, "ask her to stay." The journals were in a trunk, not hidden precisely, not buried or coded or disguised as something else, but placed with the deliberateness of a woman who had understood that concealment and preservation were different operations requiring different methods. The trunk itself was cedar, old and dark, its brass hinges gone green with age, stored beneath the floorboards of the east guest room, behind a panel that Osythe Morcant had pried loose, sometime in the chaos of the first terrible, weeks after Elswith's departure, and replaced with such careful craftsmanship that 18 years of housemaids had cleaned around it without ever knowing it moved. It was Cressida who told Maren where to look. She did it that same afternoon, while Leofric sat in front of his estate ledgers staring at columns of figures that had ceased to constitute language. Cressida knocked once on the east guest room door, entered without waiting for an answer in the manner of a woman who had abandoned that social convention some decades prior, and told Maren about the trunk in the same tone she might have used to relay a meeting time. Maren asked no questions. She knelt on the floor beside the paneling and pressed her thumb along the lower edge of the board until it gave. The cedar smell came up first, then the smell beneath it, older, more difficult. Lavender water and something fainter still, which she did not try to name. She lifted the trunk herself. Cressida sat on the edge of the bed and watched and did not offer to help, because she understood precisely when assistance became intrusion. There were 7 of them, not ornate leather volumes. These were ordinary household account books with marbled paper covers, repurposed entirely, their original domestic columns abandoned after the first few pages in favor of the close, careful script that Maren had seen only once before, in the signed declaration that had gone to the Edinburgh solicitors, the only piece of her mother's handwriting she had ever possessed until now. She sat on the floor and read. She had prepared herself for Merophon. She had prepared for the Duke's cold reception, for the legal challenges, for the physical shock of seeing the place her mother had described across 18 years of careful, measured letters. She had prepared, in the thorough way Elswith had taught her to prepare for anything. For the particular difficulty of looking at a man who had done what Leofric had done and being required to remain composed, she had not prepared for her mother's voice. Not the voice Elswith used in correspondence, that careful, slightly formal register of a woman who wrote knowing others might read. This was the voice of a woman alone in a cold house, writing in the small hours because silence had become worse than her own thoughts, setting down in cheap, repurposed account books the interior life she had shown to no one. He did not look at me at dinner. This is not unusual. I have learned not to read meaning into it. I tried in the early months to determine what I had done to occasion the silence, and spent considerable effort adjusting my behavior accordingly. And it made no difference. I eventually understood that it was not about behavior at all. It is simply the way he is arranged. He does not look at people he has already categorized, and I was categorized before I arrived. Wife, necessary, managed. I wonder sometimes if he looks at anyone. Maren sat with this for a long time, then she turned the page. She read for 4 hours. The light shifted from grey afternoon to amber evening to full dark, and she did not notice because she was elsewhere. She was in the breakfast room at Merofen, in the 2nd year of a marriage that had been arranged with all the warmth of a legal transaction. She was kneeling in the lavender garden, trying to build something small and tended that she could call her own. She was standing at the nursery door, touching the handle without opening it, because the child inside her had moved for the first time that morning, and there was no one to tell. Near the back of the 5th journal she found the entry she would return to for the rest of her life. I told him tonight. I had waited 3 months to be certain. I had planned what I would say. I had even hoped, and I recognize, writing it now, how foolish this is, that it might change something, that there might be some version of him capable of being reached by this. He said, "I suppose that is settled then." I left the room before he could see my face. I do not think he noticed that I had left. Maren set the journal down and pressed both palms flat against the floorboards and did not move for a long time. She was not weeping. She had stopped weeping in any serious sense at 11 years old, when she had asked her mother directly whether her father had known about her. Before she came, and her mother had said yes quietly, in the way that meant the subject was closed. She had understood then that the geography of her origin contained a wound she would spend her life deciding what to do with. The last entry was dated 3 days before the disappearance. I am leaving. I have been leaving for months in small ways, without naming it even to myself. But tonight he said, and the conversation had been so ordinary, so indistinct from 100 others in this house. He said that he had never wanted this, that the marriage had been his family's arrangement, and that he had fulfilled his obligations, and that he expected me to understand what that meant. I stood there and understood what that meant. I do not hate him. I want to be precise about that. He is simply a man who was never taught that other people were entirely real, and who therefore moved through the world treating them as scenery, and who caused the kind of damage that men like him cause without ever knowing damage was occurring, because the feedback never reached him and he never built the mechanisms to receive it. But I cannot be scenery anymore, and this child will not be scenery either. Her name, if she is a girl, will be Maren. It was my grandmother's name. It means the sea. I want her to grow up knowing that the sea belongs to no one. We leave at dawn. Maren closed the 7th journal and sat in the dark room and listened to Merofen settle around her. Below, the kitchen staff moved. A door closed somewhere, Leofric retreating to his study. She had come here with documents and strategy and the clean, righteous anger of a woman who had read her inheritance in her mother's silences. She had not come for understanding, but the journals had given her something more difficult than anger, and she let it sit in her chest without resolution, and did not yet decide what to do with it. Outside, the iron gates groaned once in the November wind. He chose the library. It was a calculated choice, one of the last genuinely calculated choices Leofric had made since Maren's arrival had begun dismantling his capacity for them, because the library was still his in a way the rest of Merofen had already ceased to feel entirely his. It contained his books, arranged in his system, on shelves that he had commissioned to his specifications, and it smelled of the leather and dust and cold stone that he associated with the only version of himself he still recognized. The Duke, the administrator, the man who governed by precedent and managed by distance, and required no one's understanding of his methods in order to execute them. He had a marraine summoned there after breakfast on the 4th morning. Not invited. Summoned. The distinction mattered to him, and he had the brief, cold satisfaction of seeing, in Mrs. Pellow's expression when she delivered the message, that it had been noted. Marin arrived 7 minutes later. She did not appear hurried. She stood in the doorway of the library and looked at him standing behind his reading table, at the documents he had, arranged on its surface, at the deliberate architecture of authority he had constructed in the preceding hour, and her expression shifted in a way so subtle it might have been imaginary, a very small adjustment around the eyes. The kind a person makes when they recognize a move that has been made against them, and find it, on the whole, unsurprising. She came in and sat down without being offered a chair. He had prepared 3 lines of argument. The first concerned jurisdiction. The Merophon entailment, he explained, drawing the relevant document toward her across the table, had been drafted under conditions that predated current inheritance law. There were legal scholars, men of considerable reputation, who had written extensively on the ambiguity of the phrase legitimate issue as it had been understood in the original charter, and whether that phrase had ever been intended to encompass a child born outside the estate, registered in a foreign county, and raised without any formal acknowledgement from the title holder. Marin listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap. Then she said, "The Lord Chancellor's office has already reviewed that argument. It is addressed in the supplementary document, page 4, 3rd paragraph." He moved to the 2nd line. The question of Elswith's departure, he said, could be construed legally, not personally, he emphasized the distinction, as an abandonment of the marital home. A wife who left without formal separation, without legal proceeding, without the knowledge or consent of her husband, who subsequently raised a child in secrecy across the border. There were grounds, he said, for questioning whether such a departure constituted a severing of certain rights and protections, that the law extended only to wives who remained. "My mother was pregnant," Marin said. Her voice had not changed register. It remained exactly as it had been when she entered the room, measured, unhurried, free of emotion in the specific way of someone who has chosen to keep their emotions for purposes other than this conversation. She was pregnant, alone, and she left because the man who was legally obligated to protect her told her, clearly and without ambiguity, that he had never wanted her. "I would be careful, if I were you, about how loudly you would like to make that argument. These walls are old. They carry sound farther than you might prefer." The library was very quiet. He tried the 3rd argument, because he had prepared it, and because stopping felt too much like surrender, and what Leofric had always done when cornered was press forward on the grounds that motion was preferable to stillness. The 3rd argument was about the estate itself, about the management of it, about the reality that a young woman of 18, however educated, however well prepared, could not be expected to assume the administration of a property of Merophon's scale and complexity without a period of, he chose the word carefully, guidance. That it would be in everyone's interest, including hers, to proceed incrementally, to establish a structure of, "I have been studying the Merophon accounts for 3 years, Marin said. Cressida obtained copies. The eastern drainage system has not been properly maintained since the 7th year of your tenure and is now failing in 2 places. The tenant farms on the northern boundary have been under-rented for a decade, which means you have been losing approximately £400 annually in income that should have been yours by simple renegotiation. The portrait corridor roof requires immediate repair before the winter worsens. or you will lose the ceiling the same way you lost the East Gallery." She paused. "I am not here to be guided. I am here to correct 18 years of neglect." It was the word neglect that did it. Not said viciously, not weaponized, not delivered with the satisfaction of a person who has been waiting to use it. Simply placed on the table between them, alongside the documents, as a category of fact. The same way she had placed the legal letter on his desk on the night of her arrival. The same steady, unanswerable accuracy. Leofric stood behind his reading table in the library he had chosen because it was still his, and looked at his daughter and felt the last procedural argument leave his body like air, leaving a room when all the windows are finally opened. He said nothing. She rose, straightened her notebook, and looked at him for a moment with an expression he had not seen on her face before. Not triumph. Something quieter and considerably worse. "I am not your enemy," she said, "but I need you to stop behaving as though you can manage me the way you managed her. You could not manage her. You discovered that too late. Do not make the same discovery twice." She left him standing among his books, the documents on the table, his documents, his arguments, his last assembled fortress of authority. Sat exactly where he had arranged them, and were worth precisely nothing. It was Cressida who engineered it. She did it the way she engineered everything, without announcing her intentions, without requesting permission, with only the mildest suggestion, delivered at exactly the right moment to exactly the right person. She found Leofric in the portrait corridor on the 5th evening, standing before his own painted face in the way he had taken to doing since Maren's arrival. Not from vanity, but from some compulsion she understood without requiring him to explain it. The need to locate a version of himself that felt continuous with the man he had once believed he was. And she stood beside him for a moment in companionable silence before she said, "She is going to the nursery tonight. She told me this morning. I thought you should know." She left before he could respond. He went because he could not go. He understood this about himself, only when he was already in the corridor, candlestick in hand, moving toward the east wing with the particular purposelessness of a man who has always stopped pretending his body, takes instruction from his mind. The nursery door was open. A lamp burned inside, Maren's casting its warm, small light across the threshold and into the corridor beyond, and in that light Leofric stopped walking. He had not seen the inside of this room in 18 years. He had not permitted himself to see it. He had constructed, around the closed door at the end of the east corridor, an entire architecture of avoidance, of necessary things to attend to, of ledgers requiring his attention, of a very old and very effective capacity for directing his gaze away from anything that threatened to make the damage real. The door had remained closed because opening it would have constituted an admission, and he had not yet found anything he had to admit in a form he could survive. Maren was standing at the window with her back to him, looking out at the dark fenland. The cradle was between them, old oak, simply made, with the carved running border along its sides that Elswyth had asked for, in the 2nd month of her pregnancy, one of the very few things she had asked for, directly in her own voice, without the careful diplomatic framing she used for everything else. He had ordered it made without comment. He had not asked her why she wanted that particular border, or what it signified, or whether there was a story behind it. He had not asked her very much of anything. "Come in," Maren said, without turning, "or don't. But if you stand in the doorway much longer, I am going to find it distracting." He came in. They stood on opposite sides of the cradle for a moment, which had a quality about it that Leofric could not name without naming too much. Then Maren turned and looked at him, and the lamplight caught the angle of her face, and it was his wife's face, and it was not, and the simultaneous presence of both things in the same room was more than he had previously understood himself to be capable of bearing. "Tell me about that night," she said. "Marin, I have read her account." Her voice was not unkind. It was something more difficult than unkind. It was entirely fair, which left him nowhere to go. "I want yours. Not a defense. Not a legal position. What you remember." He looked at the cradle for a long time. Then he sat down in the nursing chair beside the window, an unpremeditated movement, his body making decisions again. He set his candlestick on the sill, and he told her. He told her the truth of it, which was both more and less than he had expected it to be. He told her that the conversation had begun at dinner, unremarkably, as Elswith had written, as the worst conversations always do, and that something had accumulated in the evening that he could not now account for, some private distress he had not examined and therefore had not managed, and that he had said what he said not with cruelty but with the blunt, unthinking tactlessness of a man who had never been required to monitor the damage his honesty caused, because there had never been anyone close enough to be damaged by it. He told her that he had known, as soon as the words left him, that he had done something irreparable. He had known it the same way he sometimes knew a calculation was wrong before he had worked out where the error was. A feeling in the working, rather, than the result. But the words were already in the room, and he had not known how to retrieve them, and he had done the thing he always did with damage he did not know how to repair. He had said nothing. He had looked away. He had allowed the silence to close over it. He told her that he had woken at 4 in the morning to a house that was breathing differently. Not a sound, not a movement he could identify, simply a change in the quality of the air. The way a room changes when the thing that gave it meaning is no longer inside it. He had dressed and gone to her room and found it empty, with the particular emptiness of a space that has been vacated with intention rather than absence. He had gone to the garden. The side gate was unlatched. The fog was already thick. He stopped there. Marin was watching him. The lamplight moved between them. "And then," she said very quietly. "And then," he said, "I closed the gate and I went back inside." His voice was entirely level. This was not composure. This was the voice of a man reciting something he had said to himself so many times in the years since that it had worn smooth like stone beneath moving water, and the smoothness was not peace but only the absence of anything left to abrade. "I told myself she had gone for air. I told myself she would be back before morning. I waited until morning." He paused. She was not back. The nursery was very quiet. Outside, the fenland lay in perfect darkness, the same darkness it had been on that night, the same darkness it would be on every night he had remaining. "You did not go after her," Marin said. Not an accusation. A clarification, in the voice of someone completing a record. "No," he said. "I did not go after her." He looked at his daughter across the empty cradle. She looked back at him with her mother's eyes, and in them he saw not hatred. He had braced for hatred, had built certain defenses against it, but something that undid those defenses far more thoroughly. She saw him entirely, the damage and the cause of it and the 18 years of hollow consequence, and the man still sitting inside all of it, diminished and unrescued and entirely his own construction. He had never, in 53 years of life, been seen so completely. He found he could not look away. The letter arrived on the 6th morning, and Leofric did not know about it until it was too late for knowing to be useful. It came from Lord Ashvere of Dunmore, a man whose family had held land adjacent to the Merofin boundary for 4 generations, and whose opinion, in the councils of the Northern Lords, carried a weight disproportionate to the modest size of his estate. Leofric had known Ashvere since boyhood, had hunted with him, corresponded with him, relied on him in the quiet, untested way of men who assume their allies require no maintenance because they have never had cause to test them. The letter was addressed to Maren, Mrs. Pellew brought it to the breakfast table on a small silver tray, with the careful neutrality of a woman who understood exactly what it signified and had decided that her role was delivery and not commentary. Maren received it, broke the seal, read it, and set it beside her plate without expression. Cressida, seated across from her with her coffee, watched this sequence with the composed satisfaction of a person observing an outcome she has long since finished worrying about. Leofric, who had entered the breakfast room midway through this exchange, stood at the sideboard with the coffee service and understood, from the quality of the silence, that something had already moved past him. "What is that?" he said. "A letter," Maren said. "From whom?" She looked at him across the table with the patient. Level attention she gave to questions she had already anticipated. Lord Ashvere, Lord Penwick, Sir Edmond Crail, and 3 others whose names I imagine you will recognize. She set down her coffee cup. They have been corresponding with Cressida for some months. They wished to confirm, before extending their formal recognition of my claim, that I had arrived, and that the legal documentation was in order. The geography of it reached him slowly, the way cold reaches the extremities, first as a numbness, then as something sharper. Ashvere, Penwick, Crail, 3 others, 6 men whose collective political weight in the county represented something very close to everything that sustained the Vane Tresillian title as a living institution rather than a legal formality. Their recognition was not a legal instrument. The Edinburgh solicitors had already addressed the legal dimension, and it required nothing from the local lords. But Leofric understood, as he stood at the sideboard with the coffee growing cold in his cup, that law and recognition were different currencies, and that a duke without the recognition of his peers was a man with a title and nothing underneath it. He had spent 18 years without allies, because men who have retreated from the world find, on returning to it, that the world has quietly continued without them. He had managed his estate and attended no assemblies and declined every invitation that required to be present among people who would look at his face and see the question he was not prepared to answer. And he had told himself this was dignity. He had told himself he was above the performance of social congress, that his name required no maintenance. He had in fact been dismantling his own position brick by brick, while his sister sent books on estate law to a girl on the Scottish coast. "You have been planning this," he said, "since before she arrived." "Since before I was born," Maren said, and there was no satisfaction in it. Only the steady, unceremonious statement of fact. "My mother began planning the moment she understood what you were. Cressida began executing it the moment she found her. I began learning it before I understood what learning was for." She met his eyes. "This is not a coup, Your Grace. It is a correction." He sat down. This was what she remembered afterward, when she replayed the morning in the privacy of her own thoughts. Not the letter, not the list of names, not even the words she had chosen, but the moment when Leofric Vane Tresillian sat down at his own breakfast table like a man, whose legs had at last declined to maintain the fiction of standing. He did not argue. He had exhausted his arguments in the library 2 days prior, and they had availed him nothing, and he was, beneath the pride, beneath the cold administrative precision, beneath everything Merophon had made of him, an intelligent man. And intelligent men eventually stop pressing on walls that have already decided to stand. "The tenants," he said finally. "The ones on the northern boundary." His voice had a different quality than it had carried in any previous conversation. Something had been removed from it. Not warmth, which had never been its characteristic, but a certain armature of authority that had functioned. She understood now as a substitute for warmth. Without it, the voice was simply old, simply tired. "They are good people," Ramsden has farmed that land for 30 years. Whatever changes you implement will be discussed with the tenants directly, Marin said, before they are implemented, and the rents will be renegotiated fairly, not extracted. She paused. I am not you. The words landed in the room, and neither of them moved to retrieve them. Cressida set down her coffee cup and looked at the window with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to know that some silences are not meant to be filled. The morning light came through the old glass and fell across the table between the three of them, and in it the dust motes moved slowly in the warm, still air, unhurried, as though the house itself had finally exhaled. Leofric looked at his daughter. He looked at her for a long time with an expression that she was not certain she had language for, not the cold assessment of their first meeting, not the procedural hostility of the library, not the broken openness of the nursery, something that had not been on his face in any previous moment of this long week. Recognition, perhaps, the particular kind that comes not from seeing something new, but from ceasing, at last, to look away from something that has been visible all along. No, he said quietly, you are not. On the morning of the 7th day, Leofric did not come down to breakfast. Mrs. Pellew reported this to Marin with the carefully modulated concern of a woman who had spent 18 years calibrating the distance between professional discretion and genuine alarm, and who had decided, this morning, that the situation warranted precisely measured honesty. The Duke, she said, was in his study. He had been there since before dawn. He had declined breakfast and had not rung for coffee, and had specifically requested that he not be disturbed. Marin listened to all of this, thanked her, and went upstairs. She knocked once. There was a silence, not the silence of a man who had not heard the knock, but the silence of a man deciding, and then his voice, low and even, "Come in." The study was exactly as it had been on the night of her arrival, down to the untouched quality of the air, the cold ash in the grate, the 2 gold rings still sitting in their shallow dish on the side table. She had assumed, in the days since, that he would have moved them. He had not. They sat exactly where they had sat for 18 years, and she did not look at them for long, because looking at them did something to her chest that she had not yet decided she was ready to examine. Leofric was standing at the window with his back to the door. He was not looking at the fenland, or he was, but the quality of his attention was inward rather than outward, the way a man looks at a landscape when he is not seeing the landscape, but using it as a surface against which to see himself. The Ashvere letter, he said without turning, and the others. I should like to know if you intend to respond to them formally before the month is out, or whether the recognition is already sufficient for your purposes. I will respond formally, she said, within a fortnight. There will be a small gathering. The local lords, the estate solicitors, the tenant representatives. She paused. You are invited. That is not a formality. I mean it. He turned then. He looked at her across the study, across the desk where she had set the legal letter on her. First night, across the cold grate, across the dish with its 2 gold rings, and the morning light from the window caught the silver in his hair and the new unguarded lines of his face, and she was struck again by the thing that had been striking her intermittently all week. How much of him was in her? Not the coldness. She would not claim that inheritance, but the structure beneath it, the bone and the brow and the refusal to perform what was not felt. There is something I want to give you, he said. He crossed to the desk and opened the lower drawer, the one she had not seen opened in any of her days at Merofen, and he removed a single envelope. It was not sealed. It bore no address. He held it for a moment with an expression she had come to recognize as the external sign of an internal accounting, the face of a man adding up a column and accepting the total, and then he held it out to her. She took it and opened it and found inside a letter, not legal paper, personal stationery, his own, the Merophon crest embossed at the top, though the paper had yellowed at the edges and the ink had the specific darkness of something written a long time ago and preserved without ever being sent. The date at the top was written 18 years and 3 months prior. Elsewise it began. I have been sitting in this study since before dawn, trying to compose what I ought to have said last night. And I find that composition is beyond me. What I said to you was true in the way that the worst things we say are true, accurately representing a fear I have held for the duration of this marriage and never had the courage to examine, because examining it would have required me to be honest about what that fear is. It is not that I did not want you. It is that I did not know how to want anyone without losing myself in the wanting, and no one ever taught me that losing oneself is sometimes the only honest act available. I do not expect this letter to repair what I have broken. I am not certain anything can. But I want you to know, I need you to know, because you will leave. I can feel it in the changed quality of the house, and I cannot stop you and do not think I should. That the fault is mine, entirely and only mine. You came to this house with every quality I lacked the generosity to deserve, and I repaid you with absence when you needed presence, with silence when you needed to be heard, with the cowardice of a man who mistakes withdrawal for dignity. I am sorry. I do not know whether that word is sufficient. I suspect it is not. I did not send this. I did not know how. L. Marin read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it in both hands and looked at the man across the desk, at 53 years of pride and damage and the cold, costly discipline of a man who had been taught from birth that need was weakness and that the opposite of weakness was distance, and she felt the complicated thing she had been carrying since the nursery settle into a shape she could finally identify. Not forgiveness, not yet. Forgiveness was not a morning's work, and she would not insult either of them by pretending otherwise, but the beginning of a possibility, a door not opened, merely unlocked. She should read this, Marin said. I know, he said. I intend to go to her. She had not said this aloud before, not to Cressida, not to anyone. When the formal recognition is established and the estate is stable, I intend to go to her and tell her what has happened here. She looked at him steadily. Whether you write to her before that is your decision, but I think you should. I think you have owed her this letter for 18 years, and the debt does not diminish for going unpaid. He said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the fenland stretched away flat and grey and endlessly patient, as it had stretched through every silent morning of his long captivity. Will she read it? He said. The voice of a man who had not allowed himself to ask this question until now, who had not, until this week, believed he had earned the right even to wonder. I don't know, Marin said, which was the truest thing she could have given him, but I think she might want the chance to decide. She left him there. She went downstairs to the morning room, where Cressida was waiting with the coffee and the quiet, familiar patience of a woman who had spent 16 years holding a story together at its seams, and was only now permitting herself to set down the weight of it. They sat together without speaking for a while, and the November light came through the old windows, and Merophon Court breathed around them in its altered, tentative way. Still the same house, still the same cold stone and drafty corridors and overgrown fenland garden, but rearranged around something new at its center. Upstairs, in the study where Elswith had once pressed her hands flat against her mouth and kept her eyes dry by sheer force of will, the Duke of Merophon sat alone at his desk. Before him, the estate ledgers, a sheet of his personal stationery, a pen. He looked at the blank page for a long time. Then, slowly, as though performing an action he had not known his hands were capable of, he began to write. The iron gates of Merophon Court stood open in the morning air. No one had ordered them opened. They simply were, as though the house itself had at last decided that it was done keeping everything out. The ledger for this tale is finally closed, but the shadows of history never truly sleep. If your heart is still racing, my beautiful family, don't let the fire die out here. These two stories on your screen are even darker, deeper, and more unforgiving. Tap subscribe so we stay found in the fog, then click one now. Your next obsession has already begun.